Yes.
I brought it printed, so. No. Okay, so a little bit about Chris-Craft 283s, and the last one I just finished a couple of weeks ago is out on the front porch, so before you leave today, take a good look at it. It's about 1.5 years it took. By the time we got all the machine work done, rounded up all the parts for it, et cetera, for me to finally finish it. But I was close, so I talked to the owner and I said, I'd like to bring it down to the seminar and talk about it. It's a pretty unique engine, even for Chris-Craft 283. So go ahead and turn the next slide. Okay, so the picture you see up there is my mom, me in the middle. I was just shy of my 8th birthday. And that's my older sister, who's about 1.5 years older than I am, and she was way taller than me at the time. On Lake Coeur d'Alene, in August of 1959. And the boat in the background, I believe it's a Cavalier, looks like it's painted white, had a Chris-Craft 283 in it. So my dad was working in construction that summer. I grew up in Puyallup. But this is August, and my sister and my mom and I went and spent almost a month in Spokane while my dad was working on a construction project. And he got acquainted with the owner of a local watering hole who had just bought this brand new 59 Chris-Craft with a 283 in it. And he invited the family out on a Sunday, and I got to drive that boat at 8 years old. So I was hooked right then. It was cool.
Did you get like
Now, here's the next story. Go ahead. I think the next slide. Okay. So August of 59, I got to drive this Chris-Craft boat with a 283 in it. And of course, at the time, the owner goes, man, this has got a Corvette 283 in it, right?
A lot of those.
Right? So we've all seen ads for 283s says Corvette 283. Well, really not a Corvette engine. Because the Corvette engine had at least 9.5 compression ratio and bigger valves, different heads, a lot of things that are different. And they were at least 225 horse. And of course, the Chris-Craft 283 was always just 185 horse. But there is a sliver of truth about being an original or being a Corvette 283. Any idea what that is? What could be part of the Corvette or the 283 package that has a Corvette part in it?
solid lifter?
The solid lifter cam.
I can read.
So when Chevrolet, or when Chris-Craft went to Chevrolet and wanted to get a marine engine from them, back in the 50s and even into the 60s, all marine manufacturers, for whatever reason, and Joe might know the answer to this, they always wanted solid lifters in the marine engine. Of course, now they're all hydraulics, but at that time, the only solid lifter cam that Chevrolet was making was for the Corvette. So what they used was a 1956 Corvette camshaft, and that's the GM part number. And I discovered that by looking through one of the original Chris-Craft 283 parts manuals that was published in October of 1958. And in the very first parts manual they had all the Chevrolet engine numbers. They put the Chevrolet part number by it. So in other words, you could go to Chevrolet and buy the part instead of going to Chris-Craft and buy it. And in subsequent parts manuals, then they dropped the Chevrolet parts manuals, and Chris-Craft wanted to sell you the Chevrolet part. But looking up the original camshaft part number, lo and behold, it was for a 56 Corvette with either single or dual 4 barrels. Just the camshaft that Chevrolet used it. So there's a sliver of truth. They got a Corvette camshaft in them. Okay?
Karl, what's the advantage of a solid lifter?
Good question. Do you have any idea, Joe?
Well, it was always thought to be a better product. That's what they used in the trucks and
Right.
heavy duty vehicles. They always use a solid lifter. because there's less. I mean, the hydraulic lifters at the time weren't that wonderful, I guess, and there was.
Time life?
All of
Well,
the
in the
fifties and early
50s,
sixties,
they
the
were all
marine
solid.
engines all had solar lifters, all the grain marines, all of them.
Race
used-
cars had them too, I mean, anybody that was high
Right.
performance always went to the
Right.
South.
I thought it was due to, you could get a higher RPM out of it.
Chris Craft only rated this
They
engine.
weren't very high RPM.
Yeah, they didn't want you to, they voided the warranty if you went more than 4,000
Yeah,
RPM.
4,000 was the top.
So not a,
I don't think technically they needed them, but they used them.
right. So go ahead, next. In June of 1999, I bought I bought the boat in February. Ron Stevens was with me the day we picked it up, right? I bought a 1941 34-foot Chris Craft Deluxe enclosed cruiser, had the original M in it, and a couple weeks later, Ron and I went down there and we got it running. It hadn't ran in 5 years, and it ran, but boy, every time I parked it for a couple weeks, the valves would stick again. It had water intrusion coming in the intake, and it was really getting tired, and I thought, I kind of like the boat, but I'm done with this M. So Ron and Dick Dow had a pair of 283s out of their boat. They put Qs in it, so I helped them put their Qs together, and then I got the parts for a 283. And I used, in the first one I did for my cruiser, I used a 350 long block, and put it together with the 283 package. And the real neat thing about using a 283 conversion is that it had a manual transmission, and so the shift linkage was totally original in it. I was able to adapt the original throttle linkage, and it had a tack drive cable. I was used to be able to use the original tack in the boat. So from the helm, everything looked totally original, and I was able to put a 350 Chevrolet single engine in this boat. And I owned that boat for, 19 years, something. Sold it about 4 years ago. Still in Ron's boathouse, right? The boat.
It just left a week ago.
Oh, he's got different mortgage for it? Don't know. Anyway, so that was my first encounter of putting one together. Obviously, my background is I spent 10 years working at a Ford dealership full-time. Then I went and taught at a community college for 29 years. And then I went back and worked another 15 years summers at the Ford dealer. So I had about 25 years of Ford working as an automotive tech and teaching automotive. Obviously, the engine part was kind of the easier part for me. So that was kind of my background. But there's a lot of things about a 283 that you learn the hard way, because you got to put them together and you make a mistake, and then you solve it. There's still boogeymans out there. Warren's dealing with one right now, and we haven't come up with the answer for it. Maybe one of you might know it. He's getting aeration in the oil, even when he primes it. And so it's been apart a couple of times, and he hasn't come up with a solution to it. Anyway, the engine I brought with me, and it's out on the front porch. We had hoped to be able to bring it in here on the cart, but there's no way they were going to let us roll it across that epoxy floor out there. So it's not here, but I wanted everybody to see it, so I took the trouble of bringing it so you can take a good look at it. And this one, I counted the other day, and I've put together 10 Chris Craft 283s, at least the parts, but I've done it using original 283 blocks. I've done it using small journal 327s, and I've done it using 350 long blocks. And you got to do some different things, especially with the 350. The rods will hit the oil pan, so you got to grind the oil pan. Or you can use a 350Q oil pan on a 283 if you drill and tap a couple extra holes. But it can be done. This is the 4th engine I've done for this customer. He's a collector in California. He has not put any of them in a boat yet. He doesn't have a boat for any of them. He likes them. The other ones I made run, solved any issues, because usually there's something once you get them started that you gotta deal with, a coolant leak or an oil leak or something. And he came and got him, and he's an airplane guy, and he does old airplanes like this, and he's got a hanger, and so he puts these things up on his hanger shelf, and he's happy. So then he decides, I want an early number 283. I want to find the earliest serial number that we can find on a Chris Craft 283. So I think he and I both looked for about a year, and he came up with serial number 1190. And then a few months later, I found serial number 444, which is that engine out there in the Midwest. And so he called the guy up, and he made the deal, and I don't know, he paid $300 or $400 for the engine, and it actually cost him more to ship it to me than he paid for the engine. So he wanted a really early one. This one was built September 10th, 1958 for the 59 model year. We think they actually built the first ones maybe the end of July, first part of August, to get to 444 of them. We did contact the Mariners Museum, and the total number of Chris Craft 283s, they built them from 1958 till 1967 was the last ones. They built 41,636 of them, okay? All of them flywheel forward. And again, I found this one online in the Midwest, and I had it shipped to me. I got it, it's been a year ago. I've had it for a year and a half. I got it in the summer. Go ahead, next slide. And here's a picture of it as I got it. A whole bunch of things are different about the early serial number 283s. One of them I'm sure you pick out right away is it's got Chevrolet script valve covers, okay? And 99% of the ones I have seen did not have the Chevrolet script on the valve covers. I don't know what serial number they went away from them, but we have proof that the Chevrolet script valve covers were original, because I think I go to the next picture, you'll see it. These are just some more pictures of this engine when I started with it. The very early ones only came in one configuration. They had iron intake manifolds, Carter carburetors, and all the ignition system and generator was all Autolite. Keep going, I think there's several more pictures of it. You can see a few little different things about the transmission. It had wire ties on the very back of the shaft or the coupler that I've never seen on any of this. The 2XE Paragon transmission. Okay, go ahead. I think there's about 4 or 5 pictures of it. That's original water pump on it. 16 vein water pump. And if you're putting one together, you really probably don't want to use that pump, but this engine has it. This guy wanted everything just as 444 was built. So it's got the original 16 vein pump on it that I did rebuild it, put all new parts in it. Okay, go ahead. There's the block number on the back of it, the casting number, which is, if you look it up on the Chevrolet casting numbers, and you've done that, is like an industrial type engine, the casting numbers for it. Okay, go ahead. There's another one of the casting numbers. See the heads on it? I call them the twin peak. Those casting numbers on those don't show up in the parts list either, of the casting numbers on the heads, but I'm sure they're truck heads because they're 8-to-1 compression. They're big CC heads. Okay. Go ahead.
The industrial casting, were these 4-bolt or 2?
2-bolt. No,
2-bolt.
Chevrolet didn't have 4-bolt until they came out with the 350s.
Okay.
Probably in about 69 or 70, something like that.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so put together September 10th, 1958, and the date is on the block. If you go out and take a look at it, it's on the pad where Chevrolet puts their numbers. So they stamped the date in it. And then I emailed the Chris Craft collection to see pictures of early 283s, to see all the little things that were different on the early serial numbers, okay? I disassembled it and I took it up to Action Auto Machine in Shoreline, Washington. They've done several long blocks for me, which is really the best way to go. If you're gonna do one, do it all. I mean, don't screw around. Most of the time it ends up biting you if you try to put it together without doing everything. And they replace every moving part in an engine. I mean, push rods, valves, everything is new in the engine. They also had to do some work on the heads, some welding on the heads to save them, because again, he wanted the original heads. And they had to put some sleeves in the engine block because I'm sure they sonically tested it. And even though it came from the Midwest and it was a freshwater engine, the machinist was a little leery of not having enough wall thickness. So it cost them considerably more than a normal long block would cost to have done. The other thing that's unique to the early ones, and up through sometime in 1960 model year, they had aluminum exhaust manifolds. Well, there's very few of those aluminum exhaust manifolds in the Northwest because people used them in the saltwater. And they didn't last but about a year and a half. So he looked pretty hard for a couple of years to come up with enough good pieces to put aluminum manifolds together for this engine. When I got the engine, it had iron ones on it. They'd already failed. So we did find all aluminum. The only piece that isn't aluminum are the very end piece, the mixers. And if you look at them, those are the reproduction ones that Seaway sells. They're made out of bronze, and they're $370 each. So we bought a new set of those. They're on this engine. So if you look at the ends, they're bronze colored instead of aluminum, okay? Next picture. So we wanted to make it just like the pictures, and this is a picture, and of course I had it on my computer and I zoomed in and we tried to read the number, but we think this is something like number 10 that was made. So Chris Kraft took some pictures of them, and from these series of pictures is how we put everything together and all the parts we used. We could blow it up and we could read Autolite on the spark plug wires. So of course, we found a set of new old stock Autolite spark plug wires with correct boots on them, et cetera, et cetera. Other unique things to this engine is the hose clamps. They had, you tighten them with a pair of pliers. You can't use a screwdriver on them. And again, if you could look closely at these pictures, you'd see they had those clamps on them. And we came up with the original clamps for it. We had the coil bracket, we had it plated just like they did. The carburetor went to a Corvette guru that restores early Corvette Carter carburetors, and he did his magic on it, along with the fuel filter. And then he also, if you look at the data plates on them, you can buy aluminum data plates for about $25 a piece for the exhaust logs. But he wouldn't have any of those $25 aluminum ones. He had a place called Nostalgic Reflections in Spokane, make them out of brass, made a pair of them. He spent $800 for the two placards for this engine. Okay. He also had the tags made for the generator and the starter, the original Autolite ones, with the original numbers on them. Had those reproduced, and they're on the engine. So, yeah, he wanted it as the picture showed it. The other kind of unique thing, and I kind of got a laugh out of it, is of course it has an original new old stock Autolite distributor cap and rotor on it. And the early ones, again, had a dual point distributor in it. It's got the correct distributor in it. I believe it is the original distributor out of it, but again, an Autolite guru did the distributor, did a total restoration on the distributor, and it's got the dual points in it. Of course, I did all the final assembly and paint on it, and the color is a blue. I think there's another blue color. Go ahead, turn it. There's 3 or 4 pictures that we got. I think we bought they sold us so much a picture, it was like $20 for each picture. They sent them to us digitally. I think we bought 4 or 5 pictures of it, of the original ones. So we got different angles on it. You can see the Autolite starter. There's the only colored picture we had of it. And if you look at the engine, Chris Kraft didn't do a very good paint job on them. Look at down at the transmission. They didn't even paint it at the bottom. They did mask off the generator. Okay, and so we did have a color picture. Look up at the wedge on the intake manifold. It didn't get painted very well. For the
Is the transmission a different color than the engine, or is that just?
no, it's just the shadows a little bit. They just didn't do a very good job painting it. They didn't get the bottom of the transmission painted. Right? They just, you know, it was an assembly line and they were just shooting, and there's no primer on the original paint. I do have a 283 of my own that I'm putting in a 1940 U18 Chris Craft that has never been painted. And it's never been in salt water either, and it's never been apart, and I'm gonna run it as it is. Ron Stevenson used it for one season in his custom before we could get his engine going. So it's a runner, and I'm gonna leave it alone unless it breaks, and then I'll fix it. But it's totally original, and that's how I came up with the colors. I took one of the valve covers off of my engine, I used rubbing compound out, polished it really good, and then I went to the automotive paint store and I said, match this color. So the paint I used on the engine was a catalyzed urethane, single stage, and I used a catalytic or a catalyzed primer underneath of it, a direct metal primer, which Chris Craft never primered them. And then I primered it, and then I went ahead and painted everything. And I pretty much had to paint it in pieces, like the manifolds off of it to get Chris Craft they didn't bother painting underneath the manifolds, but I painted the manifolds off separate from the engine, and then had to assemble it. And the tough part is, Chris Craft also painted all the hoses. Of course, we had to paint the hoses to make it look original. So that was the tough part, getting them on with the painted hoses and not having the paint crack too bad on the rubber hoses. But there's a couple cracks in the paint on the hoses, but they're gonna crack anyway just from time on the hoses that are on it. So these are what we used as a blueprint to figure out what's really original to it. I think, is there one more picture of it? Okay. So some that is unique to the very early ones, of course, the Chris Craft script valve covers, and I think you saw in those pictures that yes, those early ones did have Chris Craft script valve covers on them. They did not have a mechanical fuel pump on them. There's a block-off plate on them, and the early ones used an electric fuel pump on them. The very early ones only had iron intake manifolds on them. And it wasn't much after this one, we finally came up with an aluminum low-profile one, because obviously a lot of these engines wouldn't fit in some of the smaller cruisers that they had, because the floorboards were too tall. So a lot of things different. A little later on, I heard a rumor that Autolite went on strike or something, so Chris Craft got Delco to do generators, starters, and distributors, and usually if one thing was Delco, they were all Delco on the engine. But later on, throughout the rest of the production of 283s, they used both Autolite and Delco. But the early ones were all Autolite, like this one, okay? So again, there's some real good reasons to use a 283 in one of our classic runabouts. And again, some of those things I talked about when I put one in my cruiser, you got a tack drive on it, you can use your original tachometer. Now, if you got a counterclockwise tack in your boat, you got to use a reverser on it. But I think by 59, they were all clockwise or counterclockwise, the tacks. So all of them came originally with one that would go clockwise. But like my 40 has a counterclockwise tack in it. So I've got Stuart Warner also built a reversible tack drive. So I've got one of those for you. And like putting this engine in my 1940 U18, again, the shifter is real easy. I had to adjust the length of the shift rod with the floor shifter by just a couple of inches to fit where the original K was. The oil pressure gauge is, you can use a mechanical oil pressure gauge to it. You can use the original ammeter wired to a later V8. All the gauges are easy to hook up, so you don't have to put special gauges when you retrofit with a 283. And of course, a 283 is 100 horse more than original K. So if you put 6 people in your boat, you're still gonna go pretty near 40 mile an hour. And it's the only Chris Craft V8 ever made that's available with a manual transmission. All other Chris Craft V8s, the Fs, all up through all the 427s, the 431 Lincolns, all the other Chris Craft V8s, all had hydraulic transmissions on them. But the 283 was available with both a hydraulic and a manual transmission from day one. But again, if you're putting in an older runabout with a floor shifter in it, it's an easy hookup for the shifter, okay? Now, if a 283, 185 horses isn't enough for you, we could do like we did with Ron Stevenson's engine, and we used the small journal 327. And that's a slick way to go because it absolutely bolts together without modifying anything. As long as you use a small journal, the rods don't hit the oil pan. You can put it together. Ron's engines, we used a set of Corvette camel hump heads on them, and I drilled the heads so they had the water ports just like the 283. And we never dynoed Ron's engine, but the other thing we did to his so we can run rain gas in it is the machinist put dish pistons in it. So I think his compression ratio is about 9.5 to 1. So you don't have to run premium fuel in them. If you do run flat tops with camel humps, you're gonna be 10.5 compression. So you better be putting premium fuel in it. So you're gonna have to buy it on the street if you do it that way. But I would guess Ron's engine is pushing 250 horse. I know he's got a 20-foot custom and we GPS'd it at what, about 43 mile an hour? So definitely gives a little more boost in power by using a small journal 327. And again, you can put a 350 in them, but again, you're gonna do a little modifying to the oil pan to make the 350 work. One of the things that you really gotta be careful of, and again, you learn all these things the hard way by making mistakes. And I think it's, go ahead to the next slide. Okay, that's 444 in my garage. I think, yeah, go ahead, next slide. I think there's a couple pictures of this engine, and again, it's out on the porch, so before you leave today, take a good look at it. I really wanted everybody to see it. It's on the custom stand that I made for the owner out of mahogany, and he wants it in some type of a museum. It may go to Obexers on Lake Tahoe. That's his latest thought. So before it leaves the Northwest, I wanted everybody to see this engine. There you can see the tag on the generator that we put.
Go back.
Yeah, no, keep going. Because I wanted to talk a little bit about, there's just some more pictures of the engine. But the real thing's here. There's those $800 engine tags for it. Okay. Okay, School of Hard Knocks, here's what I've learned. Do not, with original Chris Craft log manifolds, do not use a camshaft that has a lot of overlap, okay? You can put a hydraulic camshaft in one. Most of these I've put together, of the 10 I've done, have had hydraulic cams. But I, again, learned it the hard way, because the first engine I did for this collector, he wanted a 350 long block, and he used, the cam was out of a 350 horse 327 hydraulic cam. I fired up the engine the first time, fired right up, ran it at 2,000, broke the cam in, and I always kind of check the oil right away while it's running, and everything looked really good. Engine's running fine, and I ran it for 20 minutes. So I brought it down to an idle, and it sat there and it idles, but it had that lope that kind of camshaft would have in it, and I'm tweaking the carburetor a little bit, and I'm done. This thing's ready to ship. I pulled the dipstick out. Guess what I found? I found milkshake. Okay? So then I'm scratching my head, and I talked to a few gurus, and they said, John Flaherty from our chapter said, oh, you got reversion going on. At idle, with too much overlap, it gets a negative pulse at those mixers, and it sucks water back in, and it went into the oil. You can also get reversion, because I've done that, on a Chris Craft with hydraulic lifters by adjusting the lifters with the engine running. Because it makes a miss in the engine, and it can cause reversion doing that. So the original Chris Craft camshaft that was solid lifter did not have a lot of overlap, and we did replicate that. The camshaft that's in this engine is the same profile as a solid lifter cam, but the same profile as the Corvette one. So that's the biggest thing I learned is, of course, that engine I had to, and of course to change the camshaft, which I did, you have to take the whole engine apart. You gotta take all the housings off. You gotta take, you don't have to take the oil pan off, but you gotta take everything else off to get the camshaft out of the engine. So we did that, put a stock cam in this 350, and it was fine. Okay. I did a YouTube video on the engine I have that's never been apart. It's called The Most Original Chris Craft 283, and I think it's had over 5,000 or 10,000 hits on it. So you can go to YouTube and find that. I'm not currently looking to restore any more 283s. I've done 10 of them, but I really want to get this U18 in the water this summer. And then when I'm done with the U18, I am retired. I've been retired for almost 8 years now, but seems to take me longer to get things done now. I've got a 1937 19-foot custom that's a total pattern boat. I'd like to finish it before I die. So I'm really not in the market for restoring a bunch more of these 283s. However, if you want to do one, you can give me a phone call. I'm more than happy to tell you all. There's a bunch of other little things that can bite you on them. And I do have a bunch of parts still at home. I think I've collected 6 or 7 of these over the years. I pretty much turned them into parts engines. And the ones I've done, the 10 I've done, I've always had to go to my parts department to get some part that they needed. Certainly even on this engine, there's a few small pieces that I had to dig into my parts department for. And I do have a list, and I can email it to anybody that's interested, of all the other parts you need to do one of these restorations and where to get the parts and the part numbers on them, like the hoses and stuff. You can actually get those from a Napa store. They're available, and you just cut them into sections, and they're molded hoses, they work fine. So I've got a whole list of the parts and where to get them, and the part numbers, and what belts to use on them, and the parts numbers, and where you can get them, and all that. So I'll be more than happy to help anyone if they want to do one with information and all those little things that I've found, like the pan seal. The first time I put my own together, I didn't know that the pan seal had to be a special pan seal. And I fired up the engine, and sure enough, it had a massive oil leak at the flywheel end. And I had to take it all back apart, figured out the correct pan seal. And so there's lots of little things that you learn the hard way when you do these engines. So, any more questions? Yes, Greg.
So roughly, what was the cost for the restoration for this engine?
I know what he paid me, and it wasn't enough. I was the cheap part of the equation. He's north of 10,000 in that engine. No doubt in my mind. I think the long block pushed 6,000. And of course, finding all those aluminum manifolds, and then we had to machine the manifolds to get them, and I pressure tested them and had to machine them, and oh God, he had a bunch of, I think I had those manifolds apart, I don't know how many times, and new gaskets, and pressure tested them, and yeah, so, yeah.
So you had mentioned, and I've heard this before, there are some special holes in the heads and the block for these 283s? For cooling passages or something?
No, not really. It's a Chevrolet block, Chevrolet heads.
I thought you said you had to drill.
Yeah,
If you put a Q oil pan on one, which I did on my
what's a
Cruiser,
Q?
you can retrofit a Chris Craft Q oil pan, which is a 7-quart oil pan, and it'll bolt on and work, but you have to drill and tap a couple extra holes in it to make it work. Okay.
Now, he's talking about the water jets on the end.
Oh, the heads, correct. There is a water port on the front of the heads, and you'll see that in the pictures, and if you look on this engine. Obviously, Chris Craft drilled them, those are original Chris Craft heads on this engine, so we didn't have to do it. But if you use a set of car heads, set of camel hump heads, or any other head, early iron heads that Chevrolet made, you have to drill the holes in them. And I've drilled a couple sets myself. I've had machinists drill them before. I did one set with nothing more than a scribe and a hand drill. And I was a little nervous because this is a set of heads that had all been rebuilt. Customer was into them about $700, and if I screwed up, you know, but it worked. You got to drill them in the right place. And I've done a set. I took when I was teaching at the college, I took a night machining class, you know, and I did a set on the horizontal mill, and that's the easiest way to do it, to drill the holes in them. But it can be done with a hand drill, and I've done it. Okay. Any other questions?
A breeze.
How we finalize?
We're done.
We're done. Okay, cool.